What our economy needs now is Keynes and Marx. Karl Marx. We've been led to believe both by the cowardice of the Democratic Party, which is fundamentally a capitalist party, and the right-wing ideologues on Fox News and whatever, coupled with our recent history of McCarthyism, that any discussion of Karl Marx will instantly cause the United States to turn into a Soviet gulag. That sort of thinking is magical. Karl Marx isn't the devil, he doesn't have spiritual powers, he's an economic philosopher. For those of you who are afraid that by watching this video Karl Marx will steal your soul, I offer to you the following inoculation. Circle, circle, dot, dot. Now you've had your Marxist shot. Now, the right wing describes Keynesianism as being socialism. Keynes at his core is a capitalist who proposed a few minor adjustments to the structure of capitalism that prevent the engine of the economy from sputtering out. I also think that when Ben Bernanke channeled Milton Friedman and Richard Nixon in defense of the bank bailout, saying we're all Keynesians now, he did so to discredit Keynesian economic theory, which of course has very little to do with bailing out fraudulent banks and a lot more to do with priming the pump of the economy and making sure that the working class have the means to make their basic ends meet so that they have purchasing power to keep the economy going, to ensure that joblessness is at a low rate because there's more production, more demand. Now, under capitalism, people who have a lot of money are able to make a lot of money by having a lot of money. The rest of us work for this group of people. This group of people are what I refer to as the ownership class or the capitalist class. The reason why we work for this capitalist class is because everything's already owned. And so we don't have the means to do things like produce our own food, produce our own shelter, clothing, etc. And so we need to exchange our labor for a wage, which we can then exchange towards these other things, these basic needs. If we try to cultivate land that is already owned by somebody else, then we run the risk of retribution for being in violation of the law. Now, some would argue that this is an argument against the state, that the state is what keeps the poor down. And while that's the subject of another video, I'll briefly discuss this by pointing out the fact that the state is not the cause of what keeps the poor down. That control of the state by the capitalist class is what keeps the poor down. It is a democratic state after all. There are many of us and we have a vote, so we can determine what the outcomes are. However, there is also capitalist control because economic power also translates into political power. I'd also point out that if the democratic state did not exist, what we would have in its place is a confederation of fiefdoms run by capitalists, each with their own private police force. Now, the rest of us, those of us who work to create our income, in order to do things like buying food, to pay rent, to pay debt, to pay mortgages, we work, and our labor produces value in the economy beyond what we're actually compensated for. Now, those profits go to the ownership class. Why? Because they own everything. And the fact that they are able to make a profit is their incentive for investing in anything at all. Their ability to get even richer by being rich to start with. Otherwise, they would just sit on their money and take care of their basic needs and not interact in the economy at all. Because they control capital and they also happen to own everything, they also get to control the economy. Right-wing people like to say that they are opposed to centrally planned economies. But even in the freest of markets, under capitalism, we still have a planned economy. It's just a matter of, rather than being democratically planned, it's planned by a handful of wealthy people. How much your rent is, how much your credit card interest rates are, how much your mortgage rates are, how much your food costs are, all of these things are determined by the capitalist class. Conservative thought says that this is the invisible hand of the market. But if you know anything about the history of antitrust law, monopoly busting of, during the era of Teddy Roosevelt, you'd understand pretty well that it's not some invisible market force that is beyond the control of any person. It's the conscious decisions made by the people who own everything. So when people say the invisible hand, what they really mean is rich people. Under capitalism, with all this extra value in society being shifted upwards, where very little comes back to those who are actually doing the labor in terms of wages, value in society shift upwards towards the capitalist class, the ownership class, and resources available to the working class, the ones who are creating wealth in society, they dry up. So with a more and more desperate working class willing to work for less and less money, what you end up with is desperate poverty, slums, etc., just like we saw at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, and just as we see today in many countries around the world without laws regarding, basic human rights, basic labor laws, etc. Market forces constantly drive the cost of labor towards zero. This is because working for a company is not a voluntary exchange. People are forced to exchange their labor for wages so that they can survive. It's not a matter of choice. Either you work or you die. And if the job that you can get does not compensate you well enough that you can actually make ends meet, that is still better than not earning any income at all. As the working class's earnings, the lower 47% of America, if you will, as they lose their jobs, you have decrease in demand in our economy, which translates into fewer purchases, and therefore the capitalist class have less reason to hire people to produce things, to offer services, because there's no demand in the economy to support those things. So they lay more people off, and this is a downward spiral that occurs. So with decreased demand, there's fewer jobs, value is continually distributed upwards at an accelerated rate, and labor is increasingly devalued. That's the end stage of capitalism. This is what capitalism is always trying to get towards, is complete rock bottom. Third world style wealth divides. That is the end goal of capitalism, whether, capitalists understand that or not. That is ultimately what this system of capital pushes us towards. Marx states that for socialism to flourish, society must first go through this transition period of industrialized capitalism, from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy, and through industrialization we eliminate further and further the need for human labor, and we end up in a period of excess with poverty. Abundance and poverty. But capitalism requires a type of scarcity that makes sense in an agrarian economy, in which the main goods sold are living materials, meats, animals, vegetable products, grains, etc. Things that grow old, that go stale, that die, that rot, and lose their value over time. With capital, capital does not rot. Capital doesn't spoil, and so it instead accrues in great amounts in the hands of the capitalist class and creates class disparity. This leads eventually to socialism once enough people look around and realize that we have both poverty and abundance. And they realize that if we simply organize things a little bit differently, rather than having a few wealthy elite and hordes of starving poor, we could have enough to go around for everybody. Because of industrialization and mechanization, we'd be able to do so with very little labor. We'd have a post-scarcity society. A question asked often by the more libertarian-minded folks is, well, what's to stop one of these working class folks from starting their own business and becoming rich? Now, aside from sheer improbability, there are other factors like education, healthcare, and access to capital. If you've ever been poor, you know how hard it is to save aside any money to invest in a small business. You also know how hard it is to get startup capital in the form of loans from a bank if you have no collateral. And also, as often ends up being the case, eating and paying rent or, providing for your children ends up taking precedent over investing in, your capitalist venture or your small business. So what Keynes proposes is that wealth be redistributed from where it's collecting in the hands of the capitalist class and move it downwards into society. Keynes famously said once that what we need now is to pay one group of people to dig holes and pay another group of people to fill them in. Given the upwards distribution of wealth and class disparity that capitalism causes, this actually makes a lot of sense. What Keynes is actually proposing is that we take back wealth from the rich that was stolen from the working class through wages, and give it back to them in the form of social services like publicly funded education, welfare for the very poor, etc., which ensures that the working class and working poor have buying power that they need in order to keep the economy going, to create demand, and thus spur capitalists to hire more people to provide products for that demand. Through things like a minimum wage, social spending funded by taxing wealth, we're able to meet the most basic needs of everybody, or at least that's the goal. It's a jump to a post-scarcity economy without addressing the fundamental flaws of capitalism. Keynes does not address the fundamental injustice inherent to capitalism, that the game is rigged so that the capitalist class generally will win no matter what happens in the economy. Since economic power, power in the economy, is also directly linked to political power, the capitalists have continued to exploit the labor of the working class in order to increase their own wealth. And they've used that wealth to dismantle the very programs that Keynes and FDR helped put into place. You might be familiar with the Koch brothers, for instance. Moreover, though, it should not be comforting to us that a simple majority of people are able to make out okay in a system that is fundamentally based on the exploitation of an unlucky class of people stuck in poverty and making wages less than they need to survive. The escape routes from poverty still require that you create a business that exploits the labor of the poor, of the working class, of your fellow man, or to join the banking industry and join the capitalist class, which exploits credit and debt. Both of these are options that perpetuate the inherent inequality and class structure of capitalism. And not only that, but the capitalist class has already figured out how to get around the few minor Keynesian fixes to the economy, and they've moved their factories and their capital overseas to places where American law can't touch them. And then they use their wealth, which is now protected from the democratic state, in order to purchase power within the democratic state. We are also largely at fault here because we vote for both Democrats and Republicans. Obama's #1 contributor was Goldman Sachs. Lefties still voted for him anyway. Political activism, electoral activism, isn't enough. And this is why we need Marxist philosophy as well. The main thrust of Marxist economic analysis is that labor creates all wealth in society. Right-wing economists like F.A. Hayek and Ayn Rand sort of agree, saying that there's no true wealth without laboring for it, but they only say this as an argument against stimulus spending. And they ignore the fact that banks regularly create wealth out of thin air all the time as a basic function of their, daily existence. Banks creating wealth from thin air is actually their basic business model. If a democratically run government creates credit out of thin air to create public infrastructure, on the other hand, the infrastructure that's created is the wealth. The capital, the money that was created to pay the workers to build that infrastructure is only the means to get to that wealth. Austrian economists and their analysis of wealth creation also begs the question about the origin of capital to start with. They treat it as though it's some sort of Platonic ideal and it just exists, and it's always existed, which isn't true. Money is invented, capital is invented. Now, from a Marxist perspective, the origin of capital is fraud. The creation of capital requires things like laying claim to land or raw materials that were once owned by nobody in particular, and thus the commons. The colonization of North America by Europe is a great example of this, where land was not owned by anybody here in North America. The idea of land ownership did not exist, and European colonialists came in and just said, this is ours. The colonists had to pay rent on their land back to the crown through taxes. The natives, the people who had lived here for millennia prior, suddenly had to purchase land, which was not a concept that was familiar to them. The other way that capital is created is through the manipulation of credit and debt. Credit and debt is created by the capitalist class out of thin air. Banks are, through fractional reserve lending, able to lend 7 times what they actually have in actual cash on the books. And they create new money out of debt. And that's one of the basic premises of capitalism, is the manipulation of credit and debt. Now, with this manipulation of credit and debt by the capitalist class being a source of economic power, and all value in the economy flowing towards creditors, the economic power of the capitalist class translates very quickly into political power, through being able to buy off politicians' campaign contributions, or having the means to run for office yourself and dedicate yourself fully to that without actually doing labor, whereas working class people have to work every day just to make, basic ends meet, not able to spend very much time at all working on their campaigns. Given this, it becomes very clear that in order to have political power, the working class must also have economic power. Under current capitalist structures, the poor are in charge of keeping one another down for short-term gain. Managers are in charge of cutting benefits or laying off those who work beneath them, which, if they don't carry out orders that come to them from above, they themselves will also lose their jobs. They comply with this fascist power structure so that they can continue to maintain their subsistence. Now, if those of us in the working class were to take over the places in which we work and then run them democratically instead of respecting the hierarchy, we would be able to share profits from our labor equally, rather than shifting them upwards towards the ownership class, the capitalist class, who are not doing labor to create the value of our products, of our goods and services. We would no longer be shifting value upwards in the structure of the company by, exchanging our labor for a wage. We would be keeping, a large percentage of the value that we create instead of passing most of that value up to management or to the CEOs or on to creditors. This would lead to wages far above what is needed to make ends meet, and a high wage would allow us to work fewer hours, which would mean that more people could be hired. We could have a 4 or 3 day work week. In order to meet those same levels of demand, we would be able to hire more people to do labor, to create that value. And under this structure, what about the capitalist class, the creditors who were always borrowing credit from and then paying back more than what we initially borrow? They become irrelevant. They're also no longer able to manipulate us through wages, through credit and debt, and they lose their economic power. With the loss of their economic power, they also lose, by consequence, their political power as well. So we need Keynesian thought to redistribute value back down to the working class and the poor where it originated, so that they can have the economic power that they need in order to start their own cooperative businesses. But we also need to understand Marx to make sure that we don't end up building the same economy we just tried to escape from.
Killing you!
This is the Punk Patriot, to life, liberty, in pursuit of a less fucked up government. If you dig this video, please donate what you think it was worth. I also encourage you to subscribe to this channel for free. You can click on my nose, I guess, and that'll get you subscribed. Yep.